Slay the Spire is the result of a relentless pursuit by Studio Megacrit Games to merge two gaming genres, roguelike and deck building, into a single, captivating experience. Working as a two-person team, developers Anthony Giovannetti and Casey Yano faced many challenges that required creative solutions. They built a server to gather playtest data, shifted from random enemy attacks to displaying precise damage numbers, and created eye-catching monster designs after realizing their initial ones were very generic. Despite these obstacles, Slay the Spire went on to become one of the most popular deck-building games available. However, there was a time when both Anthony and Casey feared the game would fail after an underwhelming early access release. So, what exactly went into creating this game, and how did Slay the Spire ultimately achieve worldwide success? Let's dive in. Anthony and Casey first met during their college years in the University of Washington Bobble and quickly bonded over their shared love of video games. Under the studio name Pew Pew, they created several Flash and mobile games, releasing 2 and prototyping many others. Despite their passion, none of these projects achieved any real success. After graduating with computer science degrees, they parted ways and took jobs in Seattle's software industry. Casey joined Amazon's QA department while Anthony found a QA position at a company called Sequint. Although they were good, stable jobs, the dream of creating a unique, engaging video game never left them. After about 5 years, Casey became bored with his job and left Amazon to pursue game development again. He reconnected with Anthony, and when they met, they immediately said, "Hey, we should make games again." Funnily enough, Anthony already had a game design document ready to go, which contained the early ideas for what would become Slay the Spire. Fun fact, the project back then was titled Card Crawl. Development officially began in August 2015. From the start, Casey devoted all his time to the project, while Anthony worked on it in his spare time after work, at least initially. Casey, who enjoys fast-paced gameplay, frequently plays action and roguelike titles like FTL, The Binding of Isaac, and Dark Souls. Anthony, meanwhile, has spent most of his life immersed in collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, Netrunner, and Dominion. It's no surprise then that his personal goal was to capture those experiences in Slay the Spire. I've always been playing card games. I got really into Netrunner, and my favorite thing in card games was always drafting, where everyone sits at a table and you go around passing cards and building a deck of cards that you're passing around. Because I have that experience, Slay the Spire is very much me trying to capture the digital version of my favorite part of card games. Casey, on the other hand, was frustrated by how most card games focused on multiplayer and felt slow to play. As a result, the two developers combined their distinct ideas and perspectives to create a fast-paced, single-player roguelike deck-building game. According to the developers, this combination of genres simply didn't exist at the time, making it difficult for them to learn from others' mistakes or successes. Instead, they analyzed existing deck-building games and roguelikes to figure out what might work. Drawing on their QA backgrounds, Casey and Anthony placed a strong emphasis on user interface and user experience, studying more than 20 different games to identify best practices. Hearthstone's polished user-friendly design stood out as a key inspiration, while FTL influenced Slay the Spire's map system. By incorporating layered decision-making into the map navigation, the developers added depth, risk versus reward, and strategic planning without making the gameplay overly complex. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video sponsor, Factor. Eating stress-free has never been easier thanks to Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals. Thinking about what to eat, grocery shopping, and spending time cooking my meals stresses me out. But thanks to Factor, I've been able to eat delicious, chef-prepared meals without any worries whatsoever. They get delivered straight to my door and they're ready to eat in just 2 minutes. I get to choose from a weekly menu of 35 dietitian-approved options, including vegan, veggie, keto, and many more. I highly recommend the creamy pesto pasta, my personal favorite this time around. There's also more than 60 add-ons every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunch, snacks, and beverages to help you stay fueled and feel good all day long. The meals are prepared fresh every single day, and you simply need to heat them up when they arrive at your doorstep. It saves me so much time to focus on things I actually want to do, like make more videos for the channel. You can support my channel and get delicious meals for yourself by using my link or code to subscribe to Factor and contribute. Get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Factor, healthy eating made easy. Now back to the video. Once the two developers had settled on the game's core concepts, they began building a prototype using the free open-source libgdx framework, the same one used to create Minecraft. When their ideas became playable, they quickly recognized the project's potential. At that point, Anthony quit his job as well to dedicate all his time to development. Their QA backgrounds made them keenly aware that balancing the game would depend on steady player feedback, so starting playtesting as early as possible was vital. Through Anthony's connection to the top-tier Netrunner community, they managed to enlist some of the best Netrunner players to try early builds of Spire. Even though their pool of playtesters started out small, traditional QA sessions would have been nearly impossible. Proper QA requires extensive setup, interviews, and translating feedback into actionable data, all of which is time-intensive and would require far more resources than the two developers had at the time. The first step they took to address this challenge was setting up an internal Slack environment for all playtesters. This allowed players to communicate directly with Casey and Anthony, and vice versa. They also used a bot to collect feedback, ideas, and bug reports. It created a relaxed space where testers could leave comments at their convenience without feeling pressured. Slack also made it easy to distribute new builds on a daily basis to the entire testing group. With new improvements rolling out every day, testers remain engaged and excited to try the latest content and provide their feedback. Arguably, the most important tool they employed during development was an in-house metrics server that recorded every decision a playtester made. It was set up by Anthony's wife, Danielle Jenkins, who works at a big data company and has extensive programming experience. In short, each playtester's anonymous game data was automatically uploaded, including details like which cards they picked, win rates, and how long they played before quitting. Casey and Anthony then used this data to make precise, informed changes, from tweaking a single card's damage output to overhauling entire game systems. Early on, they were especially aggressive about making data-driven adjustments, often scrapping ideas and starting over. As Anthony put it, you'd rather make the changes early and see how it works out. This approach ensured that even those who never spoke up in Slack were still contributing to Spire's progress. The value of the server became apparent immediately when they released a build featuring one of the game's earliest mechanics: upgrading cards. Initially, players could upgrade any card indefinitely. However, the data from day one showed that testers would acquire a strong card, keep upgrading it, and ignore other options or strategies. In response, the developers changed the mechanics so that each card could only be upgraded once. However, this fix felt too restrictive, so one day, Anthony and Casey spent 8 straight hours designing a unique upgrade for every single card available at the time, leading to a more flexible and engaging upgrade system overall. Regarding Spire's combat, Anthony mentioned in an interview that he wanted to avoid the traditional approach seen in many collectible card games, where you simply draw your hand, play all your cards, and gather resources with few constraints. Instead, he prefers a style of card game that forces players to carefully consider how they play their hand. That's how Spire's energy system was born. Each card costs a portion of the limited energy available each turn, demanding a more skillful approach and making every decision feel impactful. The good guys on the left, bad guys on the right layout was mainly inspired by the game Deep Dungeons of Doom. This is what Spire looked like in September 2015. Players were already able to use the familiar strike and block cards until their core energy was depleted, as well as advance through the map. However, there was one significant difference. Players had no idea what their enemies would do next. The enemy intent system, the mechanic that would later define Spire, didn't exist yet. Instead, Anthony and Casey initially tried the JRPG model of battling enemies. This choice quickly exposed a major design flaw, so not knowing the enemy's next move isn't usually a big deal. In most JRPGs, battles are relatively low stakes and serve primarily to help players gain experience. Even if you lose, it typically isn't a huge setback. But because Spire is a roguelike, losing a single fight means starting over from the very beginning. As a result, relying on guesswork during battles felt frustrating and unsatisfying. Anthony and Casey also discovered that most players rarely used the block card, preferring to keep attacking instead, which, in hindsight, wasn't a big surprise. In Anthony's words, no one uses the defend function in a JRPG. To make battles fair and engaging, it became clear they needed a way to show what enemies would do next. A few months later, in March 2016, the team introduced the next turn system. In addition to displaying the enemy's health and other details, it showed in a simple line of text what each enemy planned to do on its next turn, including how much damage they would deal. This gave players valuable context for deciding whether to defend or plan an all-out attack. However, it had one major drawback: you could only view the next action of one enemy at a time, which meant clicking on each enemy individually. As the developers put it, battles with multiple enemies became a big pain in the butt. They also realized the game displayed too much information and made things feel overwhelming. In response, Casey and Anthony made sacrifices to ensure only the most relevant information remained visible. The next turn system was replaced with the first version of the Intense system. Health bars now appear directly below enemy sprites, and instead of a text description of enemy actions, they use symbols. This meant the exact amount of upcoming damage was hidden, only the type of action was shown. Attack moves, for instance, were depicted by a variety of melee weapon symbols that each represented a range of damage they could potentially inflict. A small sword would do between 0 and 5 damage, a larger sword between 5 and 10, a scimitar between 10 and 15, a butcher's knife between 15 and 20, an axe between 20 and 25, and a scythe for anything above 25. While this reduced some of the nuance in battles, the developers hoped it would keep players from getting bogged down by numbers. They wanted Slay the Spire to feel challenging without turning into a math exercise. After hours of playtesting it themselves, Casey and Anthony noticed how much the new Intense system improved overall usability, and at first they didn't regret abandoning the old system. Casey, who prefers fast-paced action games, especially enjoyed being able to decide quickly whether to block or attack. He wasn't constantly keeping track of numbers anymore and could enter a satisfying flow state. However, when they shared this build with playtesters, it quickly became clear that it made the experience more complicated, causing a majority of players to overanalyze every move. Therefore, the developers introduced a version that displayed precise damage numbers. Playtesters immediately preferred this approach, as it spared veteran players from memorizing damage ranges while removing tedious guesswork for newcomers. For a brief moment, Casey and Anthony hesitated to make this change permanent. They worried it might keep some players from getting fully immersed in the game or disrupt their flow state, the way Casey had experienced. The overwhelmingly positive response from playtesters ultimately convinced them to finalize this change. When they showcased the new version at local game shows, they observed a stark contrast between those who played builds with precise numbers and those who played without them in the past. Players who could see exact damage numbers responded to enemy attacks more strategically and no longer felt compelled to block so cautiously. As a result, they had the freedom to experiment with different deck builds and try new tactics. This noticeable shift in how first-time players perceived the game confirmed that Casey and Anthony had made the right choice. With the core mechanics in place, the two developers turned their attention to expanding the card pool, adding depth to the gameplay, introducing more enemy types, refining the art style and soundtrack, and developing the game's story. Although they both live in Seattle, they usually work separately, except on intense design days. During these sessions, they would sometimes generate as many as 20 enemy ideas and 50 card concepts. Each enemy began as a set of vague characteristics, which the duo refined into a concrete monster concept detailing its behavior and moveset. Only after solidifying these attributes did they start thinking about the monster's visual design. It was important to the developers that players couldn't rely on a single dominant strategy across every run, as that would quickly become repetitive. Therefore, they looked for ways to push players into having to adapt on the fly and update their card deck constantly. A key part of this vision involved creating a wide variety of enemies, each challenging different strategies in its own unique way. Another way the developers made the gameplay more dynamic and interesting was by introducing synergies, which allows players to use certain cards in tandem with others to create more powerful effects. As a devoted card game player, Anthony is familiar with the sheer joy of seeing a deck operate like a well-oiled machine. To him, that sensation alone is a reward for mastering the game. He and Casey wanted to pass that feeling on to Slay the Spire players who keep experimenting with their decks. As for the cards themselves, the focus was on designing and testing as many ideas as possible, thousands of them. We spent a long time designing the cards in Slay Spire and went through years of playtesting to get everything just right. Our process was to brainstorm thousands of different card designs and cut out the chaff down to the designs that we felt had the most impact. From there, it is all about rigorous and extensive playtesting and iteration. Casey was mainly responsible for the character art. One of his pet peeves is when a game looks too generic. Even if the gameplay is solid, it still bothers him. While discussing this with Anthony, Casey pulled up some games on Steam and remarked, "We need to definitely not do it like this. We don't want anything to be so generic that it's just another X or another Y." Ironically, they initially fell into that very trap themselves. Casey's first sketches depicted generic-looking zombies and warriors, and he immediately realized they didn't stand out. Determined to avoid bland designs, he began drawing increasingly weirder characters. Casey also drew the initial car portraits, but final renders were outsourced to Annalise Dorta, who also handled the event art and promotional images. The iconic title art and other promotional images were done by Bruce Pranaizi. Character animations were outsourced to Julia Montero and John Sandler, who used Spine 2D to animate each character. The story and lore were also primarily handled by Casey. To avoid a typical roguelike setting, he suggested adding the titular Spire. Instead of venturing down into a dungeon, players would ascend a tower. His vision was to begin with a generic dungeon at the base, followed by a city full of politics and hierarchies, and finally progress to the Spire's upper levels, filled with bizarre and dangerous areas. Once that foundation was established, Casey delved into deeper details and lore. He decided that moving higher in the Spire would represent progressing in life, which ultimately inspired the idea that characters in Slay Spire worship birds. Composer Clark Aboot was hired to create the game's soundtrack and sound effects. To achieve the right atmosphere, Clark used orchestral sample libraries where all the different parts of the orchestra are recorded separately, note by note, in a huge number of ways. This gave him the flexibility to experiment extensively until he was happy with the final result. When creating weapon-based attack sounds, he took into account details such as the enemy's weight, whether it was made of flesh or metal, whether magic was involved, and how ominous or humorous the enemy was. In November 2017, the team felt ready to release an early access version of the game to gather more player feedback and continue iterating. They prepared as best they could, but given their small team, they knew compatibility issues and other bugs were inevitable. On the night of launch, Casey and Anthony stayed up all night, fixing 35 issues in the first few hours alone. Although players reported bugs, they also left very positive reviews. Despite this, the early access launch wasn't a big success. After 2 weeks, the game had sold about 2,000 copies. The first few weeks of early access release were not like we expected at all. The game wasn't selling well, nobody knew about us, we didn't have any internal connections, and we were reading a lot of blogs and postmortems about marketing, and I felt that none of those really helped us. They tried sending out emails to press websites, but none of the bigger sites were interested in covering the game's early access release. Fortunately, the handful of streamers they reached out to before release sparked a chain reaction, recommending Slay Spire to other streamers and encouraging them to stream it as well. After about 2 months, the game began to find its audience, and by February 2018, Slay Spire had attracted over 500,000 players. The team could hardly believe it at first. According to their data, games rarely experience a sudden surge in sales so long after launch. To show their appreciation, Casey and Anthony dropped into a ton of streams just to thank the streamers directly. Over the next year, the game received weekly updates that fixed bugs, introduced new content, and refined the overall experience. During this next phase of development, it was important for the team to remember that data-driven analysis doesn't tell the whole story. Certain factors simply cannot be measured, and relying solely on numbers can lead to misleading conclusions. For example, data can't show how fun a particular part of the game is. To fill in these gaps, they supplemented their metrics by closely monitoring Slack and Discord, as well as reading nearly every post on a subreddit each day. They also organized in-person focus groups and attended as many game conferences as possible, allowing them to connect with players face to face and gain deeper insights into what worked and what didn't. Casey and Anthony also spend a lot of time observing streamers. Anthony mentioned in an interview with PC Games N that regular people aren't used to speaking their thoughts out loud, but streamers aren't afraid to speak their minds or even insult you. Consequently, if you want honest, unfiltered feedback, he suggests watching streams of your own game. Moreover, after gathering so much valuable insight through early access and their metrics server, the studio encourages other indie devs to adopt a similar data-driven approach whenever possible. In January 2019, after about 3.5 years of development, the studio released Spire version 1.0 on Steam. It received critical acclaim from both gamers and critics, and by March 2019, the game had already sold 1.5 million copies, including early access sales. The overwhelming support for the studio's first title motivated the team to begin work on a sequel, which is scheduled to launch in early access in 2025. Initially, the team chose Unity as the engine for Spire 2. However, when Unity introduced a new controversial policy that, under specific conditions, would charge developers every time someone installed a game made with Unity, Megacrit Games released its first ever public statement. They announced that, despite already spending more than 2 years developing their new game, the studio would switch to a different engine unless Unity reversed its new pricing structure. Although Unity later stated it would not go through with the per-install fee policy, the trust had already been broken and nothing could undo that for Megacrit Games. The sequel is now being developed with Godot, and the team couldn't be more proud to support this free open source engine. In the end, Anthony and Casey's dream of turning game development into their full-time career came true. Spire's success comes from our community. It sounds corny, but the extra mile many of you went to report issues, translate content announcements, create long video essays, make excellent tier lists, and draw goofy or gorgeous fan art is the reason we're doing it all again. We love our job.